Hello and welcome back to the Ramanfard School of Arts. My name is Daniel. I am the owner and operator of the school, and today I'm going to be focusing on structure using this tea kettle. So the first thing that we're going to start off with is a blue pencil that I like to use. It's a colored blue pencil, which we are going to be using on rough newsprint. You'll notice that the very first thing that I start off with is this real simple line that indicates the orientation of the shape. I also marked off roughly where I think my top is and where my bottom is. And before I ever get into any of the smaller shapes that are involved, I'm going to go for the biggest shape that I can find in the most abstract form that I can. It's just basically block out the spacing of the actual object. And when I do this, I'm not too concerned with getting complete accuracy. The big concern for me is good proportions. So if the shape comes out slightly wonky, it's really not a big deal because you're simply using these lines as parameters. They are not intended to be part of the drawing itself. The final drawing will probably mask all of this, and if it doesn't, it'll probably get completely erased out. So I'm really taking careful measurements. What I notice is that height against width, the space up top that makes up the area that I'm looking at, looking down from where I'm sitting, that only takes up about 3¼ spaces. So I've taken that measurement, and what I'm doing right now is I'm actually tapering in the sides because of perspective. So when we are drawing something, we want to be very mindful of the direction from which we are looking at it. Are we looking down at the object? Are we looking up at the object? Is it directly across from us? Because there is a subtle effect of perspective that's going to alter the shape slightly. So now what I'm doing is I'm actually curving out the entire space. So I think a lot of people would immediately go into those big, huge blocks that create the sides. But I need something to wrap this whole thing around. So I'm going for something even more primitive, which is this kind of paint canister that I'm drawing. And I really want to make sure that I'm getting a nice, clean shape that fits in space, that looks like it's 3D. And I'm going to do that with every part of this thing because essentially what I see is just a bunch of cylinders piled on top of each other. So I've got my first cylinder down. As I'm getting up towards the top of the object, the lid, I'm now going to be drawing that second cylinder, which is basically the cap that sits on top. And then somewhere in the middle of that, I'm going to place the little knob that is intended to hold the object itself. Now you'll notice what I'm doing here is using a dowel to just make sure that my spacing all works out, make sure that things are aligned, because this is where things actually do count. This is where you do want to make sure that things are not wonky, that things line up, that the spacing between certain parts of the object look correct. And that is much more advanced drawing. What I'm really trying to focus on today is just giving you this idea of not to outline your drawing, but to actually construct it, and to construct it using simple, basic geometric shapes. That's what the name of the game is in the beginning, and then we can start to pile on the details. So this is where I actually start to indicate those panels, and I'm looking very carefully to see what the spacing looks like, erasing out anything that doesn't make sense to me and keeping what does. And now I'm ready to actually, mark where I see the lines that create these panels going across each side of the object. So it's no longer going to be this round shape. I'm now bringing in this hexagonal shape that's coming in. And again, double checking my measurements. It's so key. So it looks like I may have gotten just a little too ahead of myself in terms of the overall length of the object, because upon checking it just one last time, I noticed that it is just a touch long. So I go ahead and erase that out, redraw my line, and what I was actually using there was a brush. It was literally a paintbrush that I had lying around to remove all that dust from the eraser. And again, the same exact process up top. I'm looking very carefully at this object, and what I'm seeing is I definitely need to get these sides in. Each of these individual sides have their own shape, have their own form, and I'm really looking at them on an individual basis and how they sit within the object itself. So now I actually start to look very carefully at these shapes and making sure that they're aligned right, that they make sense to me, that they look like the object that I'm actually drawing. And this is really what most people start with. They actually jump into this phase way too early. These are much smaller shapes that are far more concrete than the original shapes that we started from. So again, I can't stress this enough. We start with big, huge abstract shapes and then start to drill down into much more smaller, concrete, detailed shapes. So we're always moving from big shapes to small shapes, abstract to concrete. As I start to bring in the spout, I want you to notice how I'm relating it to other parts of the drawing. So I can't stress this enough that we really want to make sure that things fit within context, and the way that we're going to do this is by lining it up with other parts of the object. So something's bound to hit something else, something is bound to line up with something else, and it's our job as artists to find those things. So this happens with the figure, this happens with faces, this happens with everything that you're going to draw. So I am looking very carefully to see what things are actually lining up with what, and I've noticed a number of these coincidentals, a number of these lines that actually connect to other parts of the drawing. And now comes the cleanup work. This is where I come in with an eraser and really polish up the drawing and create what I think everybody wants to create from the very beginning, which is a perfect outline of what they're actually seeing. So I'm not able to do that unless I get that initial structure in. What I'm adding in now is shadow lines. So I'm just mapping out my shadows. This is often called shadow mapping. And I'm actually going to shade in all of the things that I actually see as shadow. And the idea here is just to get a light sense of value. Value is our shading, is our light and dark. So I'm getting in this light sense of our shadows, and I'm definitely not going to go with the actual colors of the object or its likeness in terms of how dark and light it is. That would take too much time and it would defeat the purpose of this video. What I am doing, however, is just giving myself a sense of how dark and light each of these shapes really are. So I'm looking for really only 3 values. Where is it dark? Where is it kind of a mid-tone right between dark and light? And where is it light? That's it. Those are my only concerns. I'm bringing in a suggestion of a shadow behind the object, and next thing I'm going to do is actually start to blend it. I want to smooth it all out, to clean it all up, and I'm using a rolled up piece of paper that's literally known as a blender, and you can pick these up at your local art store. Very useful objects for just getting a nice, clean, smooth drawing out. And the next step after this is to reinforce some of those darks. So I'm just going to push some of it so that it pops. So you'll notice in the area where there's some light, I actually thin down the line. And the idea is to really kind of unify the light as well as the shadow. So this is known as grouping, and it's a great idea when you have a whole bunch of lights that are more or less the same value, or a whole bunch of shadows. So you'll often hear in art school, group your values, because this way you have a much more unified drawing where everything feels like it's flowing into one another. So this is a very common approach to drawing, and I recommend it as well because I just think it looks beautiful. Okay, so I hope that this was helpful to you guys. Obviously, this is not intended as a full-on lesson. It is intended as just some tools and tips to help you guys get a better grip around structuring and around valuing. I hope it was helpful. Feel free to drop in some comments if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.